Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Two Old Sexperts. Today we are joined by Attorney Kate Lovelace to talk about when someone offends. Kate is an attorney and advocate born in Buffalo, New York, raised and educated in Pittsburgh. She is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University Heinz School, and University of Denver Sturm College of Law. She has served on many boards and committees dedicated to improving the lives of children in Allegheny County. She is currently on the board of Urban Pathways K-5 Charter School and teaches a law and justice class at City of Bridges High School. Kate has experience in criminal, dependency, juvenile, mental health, civil commitments, and truancy courts. She also worked as a therapeutic staff support at Presley Ridge Schools, evaluation specialist at Allegheny County Department of Human Services, and at Community Care Behavioral Health Organization and UPMC Health Plan, Allegheny County Public Defender's Office, and Duquesne University Youth Advocacy Clinic. Additionally, Kate has successfully represented a number of people on the autism spectrum or with other hidden disabilities all around southwestern PA. She received the 2022 Justice Award from the Autism Connection of Pennsylvania. Kate saw a wide gap in legal representation among families struggling to stay on track in CYF court while defending criminal charges. Locally served is an attempt to start filling that gap. Kate lives in Highland Park with her husband, Webster, and her twins, Betty Lou and Walter, who are future public defenders. Well, my first question to you is really, how did you get started? I know you've done so much work for people on the autism spectrum and those with intellectual disabilities who've gotten caught up in the criminal justice system. What led you to that path, to this work?
Specifically, there was a job that I took when I graduated from college. The first job I took was working with children on the spectrum, and I was their therapeutic staff support or support staff. I'm not sure how those S's go. So I just was playing. I was playing in people's houses, in their basements with their kids, getting bitten, tying shoes 500 times, doing trains, a lot of work with the kids. And it's easy to fall in love with kids. So I just got to be in people's houses, working with their families, seeing the support that the families wanted to provide to their own children and their appreciation of me. And so that was a really symbiotic relationship. But prior to that, I would just say the way I was just raised by social workers. My whole family is basically social workers. I was mostly raised by my dad, but my mom was a child development specialist before she passed away when I was 5. And my dad had to support a kid by himself, and he was a social worker, and he worked at a place back then called Renaissance Center, which was a clubhouse for people with intellectual disabilities. Being my only parent, I just was with him a lot. And we would run into people. I mean, this was the 80s, so East Liberty was looked different. And we would just run into clients that I know if I were by myself, I would have been scared. But because I was with my dad and he was so gentle, kind, patient, warm with people, it just showed me that I should reconsider what is threatening very early. Right? Because as a 5-year-old, I might have been very scared of somebody who just kind of came up to me and invaded my space, gave me too much information, asked me too many questions. That all would have been very scary. But with my dad, it just felt very comfortable. So that was sort of implanted in my head. And I always thought I would do child welfare, public policy type stuff. But autism was new. That was 2000, maybe even 1999. So autism was still a fairly new diagnosis. And when I became a public defender, I was seeing people with intellectual disabilities. I had a really specific moment. I was like 3 days into my training. I was at a magistrate court with an amazing, amazing public defender who was 26 or something. And this guy had been accused of indecent exposure for peeing outside of a public pool. And teenage girls saw him. So they reported like this guy is peeing behind, but he got charged with indecent exposure, which is a sex crime. And at the time, registerable. It's still registerable, but those laws have changed a bit. And I immediately knew that this guy had an intellectual disability. It was very physically and verbally obvious. She didn't see it, and I didn't know what competency meant at the time. I just thought there's something really not right about holding this guy accountable for this. And so that was like my third day on the job, and I kind of realized that I might be better at identifying autism and intellectual disabilities in this population and figuring out how to navigate that, which is different than just navigating a regular typical criminal case. And seeing my success doing that made me just want to keep doing that. So I just continue to represent people. I do other things too, but represent people on the spectrum or with intellectual disabilities who've been charged with crimes, juveniles, adults.
Yeah, you do a lot of things. And when I think of Kate Lovelace, I think of a person who, kind of gets her hands in a number of things, but she gets her hands in people who are traditionally underserved
Yeah,
or very stereotyped too.
yeah.
Whether
Or
that
very high risk.
high risk, yeah. So we have people with ID and autism. I've known you to support transgender people, and you support a lot of parents who are from very poor backgrounds too. And we don't take chances on any of those people. We tend to brush them aside, and they slip through the cracks.
And it's very expensive
Very, very expensive.
in so many ways.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I've known about you is that you're not the stereotypical attorney who is, charging several $100s to even read an email. You're the attorney who, if I can help this person, I'm going to help this person.
I'm very lucky. I have a lot of resources and support, and I'm a sucker. So anytime someone tells me a story that just doesn't sound right, I want to help. You're right. I don't charge people enough money. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had a client who was charged with very serious crimes, and he hired an attorney, and the attorney charged him $4,000 for a preliminary hearing, which is entirely too much. And maybe it was wonderful. It may have been the most fantastic preliminary hearing that would have helped me win the case. I don't know. I didn't read it because my client isn't competent, and he wasn't going to stand trial for these charges anyway. And I'm not going to charge somebody $4,000 to, I mean, if the attorney had just been more in tune with what autism and intellectual disabilities look like and listened to the story more and thought harder about it, he would have sent him to the behavior clinic or had him found incompetent, because he shouldn't have been held responsible for those crimes. And there's a couple of reasons why for that. I mean, not all people on the spectrum are incompetent.
Yeah, and the people listening to this podcast, I think that's a big element too, that maybe you could describe to people. What does it mean, or what is the process? I mean, I understand, but I want other people to understand. When you say they're deemed incompetent, what do they have to go through? What does that look like?
It can look a couple different ways. Usually it looks like going through the behavior clinic, which is a county place. It's part of pretrial services, which is a criminal court ancillary office. And one of the things that pretrial services does, besides making recommendations for bail based on background, one of the things they do is this behavior clinic, behavior assessment unit. And those psychologists, psychiatrists, I'm not sure, they're definitely doctors, will assess a client if somebody requests a behavior clinic evaluation. So that could be a number of ways. Police officers could do it, a magistrate could do it, an attorney could do it, a judge could do it, a district attorney could do it. So there are a couple of different ways it would happen. Usually it's either at the magistrate level by the officer or the magistrate, or the attorney's requesting it. So if the attorney's requesting a competency evaluation and the client goes and they're assessed by a doctor and they're asked about their charges, the competency is, can you participate in your own defense? It's not, did you do it? Or are you nonverbal? Those aren't the standards. The standard is, could you assist in your own defense? And if a client can't understand the difference between a district attorney and their defense attorney, which is pretty common, or the district attorney and the judge, or thinking that the district attorney is there to help them, usually these clients have already waived Miranda rights and spoken to people, so they don't quite understand who's there to help them. And specifically, the first time I had someone taken to the behavior clinic, he was being accused of a crime that happened 10 years ago. And I was saying to him, well, we need to look at witnesses. Like, what witnesses do we have for you and who would testify for you? And he was like, there are no witnesses to something that didn't happen. He could not understand that there were other kinds of witnesses. And truthfully, the detectives didn't think it happened either. And the charges were eventually null pros, meaning they stopped the prosecution because he was incompetent. But that kind of answer to, do you have some witnesses we could call to help you? Your social worker, your mother, your sister, people who you were with at the time, that you were living with at the time, that may have remembered some kind of incident like this, and he just couldn't get his head around that. And he was eventually found incompetent, but he went to Torrance for 9 months first. And because he went to Torrance, he lost all of his services. This man he had like one marijuana charge from when he was 19. So it had been like 10 years. He'd been living in light of life. He had a great service team. And because he went to Torrance, he lost all those services, came back to the jail, was found incompetent, not restorable, and the charges were withdrawn. And then this was still when the jail was releasing people in the middle of the night with a quarter. And this client he would have wasted the quarter calling me on my cell phone at 2 a.m, and then he would have been out of luck. So we made a lot of arrangements for him to get back in with Mercy Behavioral Health, had some connections there to make sure that happened, had him get to DOS shelter from jail, made sure that transition was there so that he wasn't going to be homeless. But there were just so many. I learned so much from that case. There were so many factors. But competency, I have a client right now who's a parent, and she's not competent to stand trial, but that doesn't mean she's not competent to parent. So competency is a criminal idea that you could not assist in your own defense, whether it's because you're schizophrenic and unmedicated, and then they might decide, well, you're not competent now, but if we send you to Torrance State Hospital, they'll restore you, they'll medicate you, they'll treat you, and then you can come back and stand trial. And that's often what is happening. But people with intellectual disabilities and autism do not restore. People don't usually attorneys don't love the behavior clinic. I love the behavior clinic because I'm always asking them to say, my client is not competent and they're not going to be restored. Don't make this go on for a year. This is their IQ.
Okay, one of the things that kind of jumped into my head too was some people believe that once you're deemed incompetent, if you reoffend, that stands or that sticks.
Well, that's true if it's not restorable. I mean, if you are on the spectrum or have a disability, an intellectual disability, that's true. If you're not competent and not restorable, then you're not competent for everything. I have a case like that too, that you know about, where there's a summary charge, and the summary charge isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it wouldn't massively affect anybody's life, let alone somebody with a disability, but there's an investigation into more serious charges for that person. And it was important to me to get that client deemed incompetent on the summary, because I don't want them to file charges on what they're investigating if they know that he's not going to be able to stand trial for it. So that's a unique example where, yes, the competency is static. I mean, if you're not competent for this reason, you're not competent. And getting that determined at any level. I was going to give you the other example where I had a client who had a guardianship already and was in a consolidated waiver, 2-to-1, full-time, 24/7. He went into the neighbor's house and took yogurt, really likes food, and his boundaries are poor, but obviously he didn't respond to the neighbor. He's not very verbal. So, if someone came into my house and I was like, who are you? What are you doing here? And they didn't answer me and just casually ate my food, it would freak me out too. So she called the police, and he got charged with burglary and other serious crimes. And we went to the magistrate, and the district attorney was very open-minded to talking with me beforehand about these issues. And, I notified the magistrate, which is often what I do in these cases, to already plant the seed, is send them a letter saying, I represent this person, this is their diagnosis, and these are the triggers and overstimulation that we could remove to make this a more comfortable situation. And then they're kind of already on alert. So in this case, the district attorney was all about withdrawing the charges. That's what he thought was appropriate. But the victim showed up at magistrate and really wanted to push it. In my opinion, it's the district attorney's responsibility to stand their ground and say, I'm not doing that. But he got nervous, and I presented to the magistrate the guardianship paper that says he's not competent to legally sign any paperwork. And so I said, he can't even comply with the no contact order that you put in because he's not competent. I don't like that there's no answer for the victim. I don't think that's great. I mean, to me, the answer is now you know, do better, be more patient, know what you're getting into, like just be more educated about it. But that wasn't what she was open to. And ultimately, the officer and the victim really wanted to send it downtown. And what I said was, okay, I won't waste your time here. We will go downtown. I will have a behavior clinic done. He will be found incompetent. And this will not be about any of you. None of you, it won't be about what happened to you. It won't be about what you want to tell the court. It will be all about my client. That's what happens downtown. It's all about my client. So you want to waste everybody's time and like have to call off court to not be allowed to say anything. That's what we'll do. And the magistrate said, yeah, I'm going to agree with her. She has guardianship paperwork that specifically says he can't agree to anything.
He's already been deemed incompetent, right?
Yeah. And that doesn't always work. Not all guardianships work that way. But I did say that to another person that called me recently. Another attorney called me about a case similar. And I said, I would get the guardianship paperwork and notify the police station because this client's going to continue to violate the no contact order because it's a neighbor and it's just going to happen. And he was like, what am I going to do? They're going to arrest him and put him in jail again. He already spent 3 days in jail on like harassment charge. And he said he's going to violate again and they're going to put him in. And I said, I would get the guardianship paper and show it to the police officer, fax it to the police and the magistrate and say, heads up, like lawsuit, lawyer, you are put on notice that if you continue to incarcerate this person, knowing that they're not competent, we're going to sue you. And doesn't mean it has to be public, but just send those messages sometimes because these aren't the cases. Nobody signs up to be a cop to do this. If they really knew what they were doing right now, they would be like, yeah, that's what I want. I wanted to be a cop to make sure that people with intellectual disabilities spend time in prison for the rest of their lives. A lawyer I talked to that likes to say capacity, and by capacity, I think he means mens rea. So when you have a crime, you have two components. There's an intent and there's an act. And both of those things have to be present for the government to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So usually what happens at a preliminary hearing, and especially even before a preliminary hearing with officers, there's no investigation into intent. I mean, there's no investigation, but everybody's responding, which is a completely different problem we can talk about next. But when you go to a preliminary hearing, you don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You only have to establish that something probably happened, this crime probably happened, and you probably were the perpetrator. And that's a very low burden for them to meet, but nobody ever mentions at the magistrate the intent. Like no district attorney or cop is ever testifying to intent. So I know I listen to all your podcasts. So stalking, for instance, there's an intent behind stalking and there has to be repetitive behavior and there has to be an intent. And a lot of these clients don't have the intent to threaten or make anyone feel uncomfortable. They're really just trying to communicate or survive or whatever the situation is. They won't mention that at a preliminary hearing. They'll just kind of say, well, he kept following her. He showed up at her house 3 times and then went to the school. So we've established our burden, send it downtown. And I'm kind of on the side of like, what about what he meant to do? It's kind of the system works that doesn't matter at the first stage. And once you get past the first stage, there's a criminal docket sheet. So like if you can resolve something at the magistrate, you'd have to be looking for magistrate non-criminal offenses to see that. But once it goes past the magistrate because nobody talked about intent and it just went there, now there's a whole criminal docket sheet. And if they're applying for jobs, they're pending felony charges.
We talk about being between a rock and a hard place. I mean, you have the legal system, well, the police and the people that are protecting others on one side, and then you have a human being that is doing something and that they can't seem to control, but it's up to us to sort of try to do the best we can to help them understand what they're doing. And, if someone is nonverbal, well, I mean, we all know if someone's nonverbal and depending on their level of understanding, it's so difficult. It's one of the things that I've mentioned before is child pornography, that often people with autism end up in prison because of child pornography, but they've never made the connection between, they simply say, I would never harm a child because they're just watching it. They just don't understand the whole process behind the child, get how the child is harmed. But it's just so incredibly complicated because we have people that could live fuller lives if both sides of it understood more. Those of us that are trying to help people to live full lives, if we could dig deeper somehow, if we can, sometimes maybe we can't, but dig deep enough and in a way that they do understand and help them, and then work with the other side, with the police and the court systems.
To piggyback on that, because I know you've mentioned that before, and it always reminds me of a client I had whose reported IQ was 60 or 59 or something. And it was an FBI sting. He was in chat rooms. He was looking for webcams. He was trying to get information on the best webcams. And someone from law enforcement got him into another room and said, kind of like, what do you want webcams for? And started sending pictures and sent him loads and loads of child pornography. And he opened 2 of them, and each of them had like 10 files of kids. And then he stopped, charged.
Setup, though. To me, that's a setup.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had other cases like that. It's entrapment is a defense, but being not competent, you don't have to put on a defense.
Yeah.
But there is an element of like those cases are flying under the radar and people aren't really hearing about them. And for the record, that client spent like 9 months in jail. And this was a case I was covering for somebody else, actually. So when I went there, he pled out to some like low charge and was released and had to complete 4 months of probation. One of the bond conditions was he couldn't consume alcoholic beverages. Why?
Yeah.
You and I talked about that too sometimes. We met years ago through a case. I think it was one of your first big cases. And I think of him as just such a lovely human being. But when you look at the actual crime that was committed and what he's required to do through probation for so many years, and this is the standard. You can't have a cell phone, you can't use the internet, you can't drink alcohol, and for a lot of these, I'm going, well, what the hell does this have to do with anything that he did?
And it's so far behind, like the fact that you can't use the internet. I mean, I used to complain when I was a public defender, why can't I get this information on CD? Like, why do I have to pick up like 5,000 packets of paper? And now they give it to me on CD. And I'm like, I don't even have a CD-ROM anymore. Like, I really don't. Like, I'm like, what? I have to go buy one and plug it into my computer so I can see what this discovery is. I mean,
oh my gosh.
What happened to zip drives and because literally across the street in dependency court, they can send me zip files. But in criminal court, I get CD-ROMs.
Hey, we're in the era of encrypted files. You don't even have to put it on anything anymore.
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Oh my goodness.
But it's mind-blowing. I mean, so many people are faced with felony charges. So many people are faced with being Megan's Law offenders, and they can't get work. But if they can get work, almost 100% of the time, it's you must fill out this application online. And so I'm sitting there with people on my internet, on my computer, helping them apply for jobs because they can't otherwise. It's tragic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people use the internet so they can see when the bus is coming.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
You can't live in certain I mean, the worst part, there's so many parts of that case, but what really drove me crazy was he was released from jail past his time, and the jail when you are released from jail, you have, I don't know, what is it, 72 hours to notify everybody where you are for him as a sex offender, as a registered sex offender. And you would think that the jail would make sure that happens. Either they notify him or his attorney or somebody to make sure that 72-hour notice, I've been released from jail, I'm now back at home, would have happened. And it didn't happen. So the probation went to his house where he was, not on the internet, complying with probation on his ankle monitor, and took him back to jail on a violation of failing to register, which is a felony. Like, he was exactly where he said he would be. He just didn't tell the state in time. And partly that's because he's autistic, and partly that's because he was supposed to be released a month earlier, and maybe we all would have been a little bit more prepared, and it just kind of happened late, and then you don't know when it's going to happen. You don't get, your released time from the jail could take up to 48 hours for you to get out.
I've discharged him now because he's doing so well, which, he's a huge success story, but he would get tearful talking about you and you being in the courtroom with him and I told him, stressing how many years he was looking at, he would have probably died in prison had you not been there to help him. And he understands that. And I think he said, between you and Kate, you were the two people that really believed in me as a person. You saw the good in me. That motivates people. And I know Sharon and I talk about our role as motivators in people's lives to inspire that change in them. It was hard. And when he got out of jail, it was hard. His self-esteem was so low. He felt like he was this deviant demon that didn't deserve anything. And it took a lot of work. Our treatment goals were not about reoffending and relapse. He understood all that. Our treatment goals were about self-esteem and helping him get life.
Exactly. I always remember what one gentleman said to me that I was working with, and I guess I can use a cuss word. I've said it before, but this man said to me, I already know I'm a piece of shit. I want you to help me be a better man. Because his whole life, and that was part of what happened in his life. He just was so damaged and broken and did things he shouldn't have done. But underneath that was a very decent guy. Once you could just help him to see it, but he couldn't, because his whole life he was told that he was no good. Yeah.
And I think that's a common theme, Kate, with what you're doing now with these parents. And we talked about them being underserved and just from really hard circumstances that the average person can't really wrap their head around. But I suspect much of it is the same.
I'm still serving people who are being really, really misunderstood by the system and a variety of ways. And I have a parent who has an intellectual disability, and her boyfriend, who also has an intellectual disability, really, really hurt their baby. And they've both been charged. Very serious, very, very, very serious. And his public defender identified the disability and had him determined incompetent. So his charges are gone. So now she's just pending all these terrible charges for behavior that he did, which probably could have been corrected and learned, like education. But I don't represent him. I don't know that much about him. But she's not with her baby for this entire year, the first whole year of his life. She's not with him every day, all the time, because these felony charges are pending. And I do think of myself as a humanitarian. I sort of see redemption in everybody. And I'm so curious I always want to know more about how we got here. And that does make me different. I just have more questions all the time. I'm like, and then what happened? And then what happened?
Exactly.
And then tell me.
Exactly.
And that makes me different. I'm not billing by the hour or the minute or whatever. I'm just honestly curious. And as people tell me things, I can kind of figure out if they're being honest or deceptive or what I think about the story. But I've really never had to question the authenticity of my clients in this arena, my hidden disability clients. They're honest.
Right. That's why
they're not trying to deceive me.
Yeah, they just give it to you. They're pretty much straight shooters. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not what they did. Yeah. I often think about that when you talk about sex offenders. Well, that's what they did. It's not who they are. There's a person, a real human there.
Considering like what Sean and I know about this particular, like, sex offenders are not necessarily dangerous to the community, and people plead to lower level sex offenses all the time, like we did, to avoid the possible punishment of being severely tortured and dying in prison. And so when I see these fears of like, oh, sex offenders are living near schools, like, people plead to minor sex offenses all the time and have to register. And it's just a flaw of the system that they sound so gross.
They become targets then. Yeah.
And similar to what we do with parents, similar with the autistic and intellectually disabled community, a lot of these people's jobs are working in healthcare and working with children, being home health aides, working in school cafeterias, and I'm not saying that those are like the common jobs, but people in these fields that get into this trouble are working in places that require clearances. That's just a whole nother level. So even if you win like the client we're talking about, I mean, he has a status now that makes it so he won't clear anything. So if he has kids in the future and he wants to be their soccer coach, it's not going to happen. So the implication, I mean, we're trying to minimize damage when, I mean, that wasn't a winnable case. So we did win in that. I mean, it was as much of a win as we were going to get. There are more defensible cases than that. And that's different. Then you have to consider who's the judge, who's the DA. Can I win this case? That wasn't a case that I could win. So it was really about like presenting the client in the most appropriate manner to have the judge understand what was really at stake. The offer was 5 to 10 years.
Oh, my goodness.
On all of the charges.
All of them. And it wound up being, what was it, 60 or 90 years he could have faced?
I think it was like 140. I'm not quite sure.
I knew it was horrible. That's what I said to him. It wouldn't have
been that. Like if he had been found guilty at trial and the judge had found him, it would have been like maybe 20 to 40. The DA was offering 5 to 10, and we got a county sentence, and he did 2 years.
And I would trust that young man with my life.
I mean, he's so sincere, and so many people can learn. I mean, my whole thing with the criminal system is like, people can just learn. Sometimes people can just learn and then they can do better. That was a case that really should have been diverted. It just was impossible. But like in the ideal justice world, that would have been a diversion.
Mm.
I always find the whole Megan's Law and, where are the sex offenders? They can't live here. They can't go there. And people, neighbors and communities and families will know that. They'll know where they are. But meanwhile, you have Uncle Bill in the backyard and you have the coach and the clergy, doing private time with these kids. And, it's the people closest to them that are the ones that offend the most frequently. And it's just like, just got to watch that guy because he did something one time. And I
don't know if Sean's the one that said this or if I heard it somewhere else, but you don't need to worry about transgender people in bathrooms. You need to worry about politicians and priests.
It was me. Yeah.
Well, I had a feeling it was, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that's,
I mean,
true.
The idea that anybody, because of their identity, whether it's their gender identity or their intellectual disability identity, whatever it is, those don't make you more likely to be any kind of offender at all.
Yeah. I once went to court with a gentleman with an intellectual disability, and he was a fairly young guy in his early 20s. And he wanted friends. He wanted to hang out with the guys. And there was a small group of guys around his age that were going to rob someplace. And they said, well, we'll be your friend if you do this with us. And so off he went, and they all got caught. And I ended up going along with him when they went to court and explaining everything to the judge. I'll never forget it. And I wish I could remember his name. It was in Harrisburg. But he said, there, but for the grace of God, go I. It's actually what he said. And he said, I want you to get some help. I want you to understand what the difference is in a real friend and someone who's trying to get you to do something that you really don't, you want someone to care about you genuinely. So, I mean, we actually worked, and it was so minor when you really looked at that side of it that helped him to see his own value. But he didn't go to jail, but he certainly could have, but if it weren't for this judge who had some sensitivity. Yeah.
If there was a real diversion court for this population, it would be amazing if there was a team like you that could be the people that, because I just find this clientele is not deceptive. They just are not intentionally deceptive.
Right.
So you can really assess, like, have they learned? There's tools to measure, like, what have they learned from this? Are they likely to reoffend? If we play out this situation, how does that go? Because you guys are so experienced with that. And so maybe in the future, if there was that kind of, I know that the court is paying a lot of attention to this population right now because I serve on that task force. So that is a way that maybe there's a future for these clients where it's like, can we really educate and see if there is a point where these charges are unnecessary? And it may not be because they're incompetent. It may be because like they did not know and now they know. Maybe it's like you suspend the plea for 1 year to make sure that they don't reoffend and then it's withdrawn, like an ARD program or something. But, clients aren't always incompetent. They're not always incapacitated. There's just different levels. Like a horror story is like when a mother calls me and says, my 17-year-old autistic child is on the bus with these other kids and they're trading sexual images of each other. They're asking her for pictures and she sent them to him and he sent them to other kids.
Yeah.
What do I do? I was like, well,
Yeah.
I don't think you call the police and report your child for creating and distributing child pornography. That's a rock in a hard place.
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't be prosecuting children for sending sexts to each other. We prosecute children for engaging in child pornography. There's lots of policy questions about that. The intended victims can't always be perpetrators too. If they're children, they're children. But when you've got a 17-year-old relating with 13, 14-year-old boys and sending them pictures of her boobs, she's creating child pornography and distributing it to younger children. That's a number of things. That's corruption of minors. That's creating and distributing child. I mean,
Yeah.
the law was there to protect her, and that's not how it would have played out. And that's a terrible situation. And court is abusive and traumatic in its own way. So I often try to assist people in finding resources like Sean or like other friends and peers that I have to see if there's another way to get what you need from this situation without court, because court is unpredictable. People don't leave feeling good, and there are ways that everybody can feel better if everybody just knows more.
Exactly.
Why are we so far behind? I see the UK, I see Australia, and for years they've had these wonderful diversion units for this population. And I'm a skeptic. I'm always a little jaded. The criminal justice system and warehousing people in jails is a huge money-making industry for this country.
Sure is.
Sean and I are about the same age. So this all started in the 90s with the Clintons and coming down hard on crime, 80s, 90s, creating this prison industrial complex, but nobody wants to raise taxes, specifically one party never wants to raise taxes to fund the jails and the incarceration. And we have most of the people in jail are waiting on detainers or waiting to go upstate. So there's not even beds upstate. Like by upstate, I mean like the prisons. It's crazy. There's just like a waiting line for further incarceration. And there aren't services in those places either. So what we are doing is having magistrate courts. We have created all these little courts around the country to fine the families of the incarcerated people. I mean, that's how I see it. So we're bringing in poor people into magistrate courts, charging them with disorderly conducts, crimes that work out to those, and then charging them $500. And that's what's funding the jail.
Oh my gosh.
It's a Ponzi scheme, I say.
It's
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. It's designed to be this broken. And one of the problems that particularly here is Southwestern Pennsylvania isn't a radical part of the country. So we still have a lot of gun ownership here. We still have a lot of poor and BIPOC communities that are resistant to diagnoses, resistant to treatment. I had a father say in court, I don't want an autism evaluation for my kid. He's not like that. He doesn't need that. And quite frankly, I believe the judge on that case has autism. So it can come all sides of the courtroom.
yeah.
I do think that Allegheny County is working on trying to find ways to make this system better for this population. I think they're
This county
dedicated to
is
that.
way ahead of the other counties in Pennsylvania, for sure.
Yeah, but it's partly the officers and the magistrates. I mean, I know I had a magistrate one time who my client was 18, but he was in high school, and he said something that sounded like he might commit a crime at the school, but he said it tongue in cheek or something, but taken out of context, went to magistrate court because he's 18. He is an adult, so he's sitting there smiling at the judge because that's how he mimics. And she is a smiley cheerleader type person. She's just very cheery. So he's responding to that with cheeriness. So she's like, do you not understand how serious this is, young man? And he's like, yes, I do. And she didn't like it, and she put him in jail for a week. And he was in
Oh.
high school.
Oh
Oh,
my
boy.
Lord.
And I said, I'd explained that he was autistic. I said, there is training available. This was a while ago. This was quite a while ago. But I said, that there's the Autism Connection of Pennsylvania does training on this. They go to magistrates and police officers, and they'll help for you to understand like what this means in the courtroom. And she was like, oh yeah, I did that training.
Oh,
And then I was like, well, now I don't know then what?
Maybe a refresher course.
oh boy.
So I don't know how to solve that problem other than I dragged a private attorney on a dual case with me to represent some people with autism, and that made them fall in love with it more. So you just get people involved. The judge of the client that Sean and I shared that we were talking about was not a kind, understanding, aware of autism, particularly was not expecting her to do what she did. But I had spent time in chambers with her and the district attorney really explaining the autism and the ADD that he had, and like all the treatment and all the supports. And she said, you don't have to keep going, Miss Lovelace. My grandson is 6 and he has the same diagnoses. So maybe like if we hadn't been in there and I hadn't been able to use my charm to kind of get more information out there, she maybe would have gone with the 5 to 10 years. She said to me, I'm considering 3 to 6. That's what she said. And then when I said all that, she said, you don't need to keep explaining to me. My grandson has those diagnoses. I'm ready. We went back out and she did 11 and a half to 23 months.
Wow.
And that's what the win was. And it's a win in itself that happened to be a client that did okay in the jail in some ways. That was,
People loved him because that's just who he is. He just has this personality. He's endearing. And listening to you talk, I knew that's why I wanted you to talk with us today, because people like Sharon and I, we're doing the education, we're the social workers out there, talking about this, but you're an attorney who's doing it. And you just did this WQED special. You're in the trenches. When I say trenches, you're in the criminal justice system,
Yeah.
working alongside people to try to help them understand these things. They'll take you more seriously.
Yeah, it's wonderful to know that there's you in the world. Yeah, so many people are suffering and don't have full lives because people don't understand them.
yeah. And I know, I think a lot about the things you guys say, and I had been listening to your podcast before I did the WQED, and a lot of what you talk about is the word appropriate, which really made me rethink even how I talk to my own kids. Like my daughter spanks my butt all the time, and I stopped saying that's not appropriate. I started saying that's not legal.
Teaching your kids to say no, responding to no. She used the example of tickling, and I never really thought about that until I heard Sharon say that, but it's
Yeah.
true.
That struck a chord with me because I do not like being tickled. It makes me feel violated
Yep.
and vulnerable in a way that I don't like. And my kids still think it's funny. And I like snapped at them like, no, I'm not joking. That's really not funny for me. The clients that I find are the worst off in this situation are the clients that are over 40, who have likely not been properly diagnosed and likely did get through and pass school, and they don't have the diagnoses and they weren't learning consent the way that kids learn it now, but they might still have the ability to learn that. We could all learn that, but there's just there's a real gap in people over 40 because there was that was mentally retarded. And if you weren't mentally retarded, you could pass. And if you could pass, then you don't have any paperwork. You don't have anything to help me prove that you're not competent. I kind of have to start from scratch. And I even have to train you to stop trying to pass with me.
Exactly.
Right? Like, don't just agree with me. I have to be mindful of the kinds of questions and the way I ask them, the vocabulary that I'm working with, and make sure that a yes is not, that the yes is a real yes, a genuine yes, because yes is a very common answer.
Yep. Especially if you want to please the person that's asking.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to please a police officer, if a police officer says, you just explain to me what happened, we will let you go. And that's true, but you've already told them what happened, and what happened might be a crime, but you didn't have it might be the act of a crime, but they're not asking you about your intent. They're not saying why. They're not saying what are your education levels. You're signing your Miranda rights because there's like, just sign this and say yes. I mean,
Which
how
brings
many
me
people
to a
even know
point.
what it means to say, I'm waiving my rights? I mean, I teach high schoolers and I have to train them on what waiving my rights means. I'm pretty sure plenty of people on the spectrum do not know what waiving my rights means. So when they sign those Miranda forms, they're just like, okay.
When I get a new person that I'm working with, we do the intake paperwork, and I stress to them, don't ever sign anything that you are not sure 100% clear on what you're signing. And I'll go through every form and I'll ask them questions to see that they understand. And if they don't, I'll tell them, you don't sign this, right? We talk about that. If the police ever come, or an investigator, someone ever comes to talk to you, do not sign anything. Ask
I
for
always say,
a lawyer, your parent, or someone you trust to be there with you before you sign or even say anything. And they say, why are you telling me all this? I said, because just in case, if there's that 0.1% chance that you get in trouble for something, you're not incriminating yourself further. They don't know
Yeah.
this stuff.
I tell all my clients, all of them, the juveniles, the adults, the people with disabilities, if anybody wants to talk to you about this and you're not comfortable, first of all, you shouldn't be comfortable. But what you can always say is, you seem extremely reasonable. I'm interested in answering your questions, but you have to call my lawyer. She's not reasonable. She will be mad at me if I have any kind of meeting like this without her. So like, if and they do, like CYF has gone to my clients' houses and said, just we're just doing an investigation. We just need to clarify that they are like being treated medically and that they're up to date on their dental records. So if you could just sign this. But I looked at it and I was like, okay, X that, X that, X that. Like, you can have like an updated letter from the doctor and an updated letter from the dentist. You don't need anything else. And if you're sitting there with a caseworker and you feel like defending yourself or protecting your kids is going to cause more problems, you're just going to agree to let them see everything. And that's can be harmful. And
Yeah.
so it's just like, I'm just saying, like, even if you have someone there, like, even if your parent came and said, don't sign this, or you can sign this, don't even really know what you're signing. When you're facing criminal charges, anyone that wants to talk to you should be going through your lawyer. And a lot of lawyers, especially the public defender's office, who I love, I'm a diehard public defender, do not have time to spend an hour with you at your house or at the jail. Well, maybe at the jail, but it's hard. I mean, I spent a lot of time with that client that Sean and I talk about. I went to his house. He was on house arrest. I scheduled an attorney meeting on his birthday so that he could get out of his house for his birthday. I am a different kind of lawyer. I do make
Are completely different.
Yeah, for sure.
but these clients all clients need that, but these clients particularly need to trust their attorney. And one of the biggest problems is your attorney is rotating. You get a criminal defense attorney, your public defender at the prelim, you get a new one at the trial, or maybe your public defender moves to trial, so you get a new public defender at the prelim. And if people aren't keeping up, paying attention, getting the documentation, there's just going to be a really fixable problem that nobody fixed. And a client who was obsessed with mail, just loved mail. He wanted to look at his neighbor's mail and the neighbor didn't like it. So the neighbor told him to stop. The client flaps, spits, gets charged.
Federal offense.
6 people. Yeah, right. 6 people had to come. So all to decide that the service provider was going to pay the $150 for the broken glasses, because when he was flapping, he like knocked the guy's glasses off. So he'd been charged with like assault, and he didn't get charged with mail fraud or anything like that. But it was like the victim was the neighbor. And honestly, like, the service provider was like, we told you we would pay for that. Why did we have to come here? Like, we would have just paid your $150 glasses bill. But someone had to drive the van. There were 2 service providers with the client. There was someone from like the county this was a different county, but and his parents and me. That's like way too many people to decide that $150 is the appropriate outcome. So either the cases that I see are really, really low level like that, or they're really high level. And, you guys mentioned stalking a lot, which is kind of mid-level. That often is lacking the intent. The behavior is not intended to scare or intimidate anybody. It's to make a friend or make contact in a positive way. It's just misinterpreted. But the sex crimes and the neighbor disputes are the most common things I see. So your neighbor doesn't understand you. And then I see sex offenses that in a variety of different ways. The guy that opens the accidental porn, the person who gets entrapped by the FBI to.
Or for me, the one that it just really just makes me crazy are two people are found together have in some sexual act, and they're questioned, and the way they're questioned, the result of that is that you have an offender and a victim, and they're neither. They're just trying to figure it out.
I wanted to go back to that because that was something you guys touch on a lot. I mean, that I would say that arguably is very similar to the case that Sean and I are talking about. You've got two young people trying to figure out, and the idea that people with autism or intellectual disabilities can't be in love. I mean, it's just also dehumanizing.
Yep.
So they can't be in love. They can't have relationships. They can't make decisions, but they can make decisions that are against the law, but they can't make any other decisions about like what they want in their love life, or, it's just a real oxymoron. Yeah, it's like they can only be victims. And it also reminds me of what I was going to say about police are responding. And everybody knows that the police are, I mean, people call them like understaffed or whatever. I would just say stop arresting so many people and we wouldn't be understaffed or whatever, but I could be wrong about that. But the police are always responding and they are not investigating. I mean, they are there to respond, to decide, was a crime committed? Who's the offender? Who's the victim? Who needs to be incarcerated or removed? Who needs to be held accountable? That, I would argue, is now becoming CYF's role as well, our child welfare system. It's a lot of responding, and responding means who's the bad parent? What did the bad parent do? Who's to blame? Like, it's just becoming who's to blame, who's responsible. And now that's even leading into your local hospitals. So, if you hurt your kid and you want to go get treatment and you don't know how you hurt your kid, you go to Children's Hospital and you might be charged if they don't like your explanation or you can't explain it. So what are the options for reaching out for help when all of these people are all responding and looking for a certain mold? Who's to blame?
If someone were to be arrested and find themselves in a situation like any of the ones that we're talking about, what's your best advice for them?
To contact a lawyer right away. And I mean, that could be us. I started this free legal clinic for parents and families who are engaged in the child welfare system and also have criminal charges or delinquency charges or have autism or intellectual disability. So if you're a parent engaged in the child welfare system and you have an intellectual disability, you can call us and we will try to help with that. There are efforts being made, I will say, like I'm on a task force committee where we're trying to educate other attorneys through CLEs or trainings on how to identify what are some available resources so that other attorneys can also be prepared for this. And I have attorneys in mind. I mean, there are plenty of attorneys with their own autistic children. So there are attorneys that are better suited for the patients and the nuances of those clients. So I can refer people to those. I mean, I have an idea of who those good people are. If I can help, I will help. I think the attorney needs to know as soon as possible because people will just say things thinking that they're doing the right thing.
And it makes the situation much worse then.
And Sean, as you and I have said so many times, so many of the offenses and charges could be avoided if we did a better job of educating people about social issues and boundaries and sexuality in general and all of it, but do it on a deep level as often as we can. because sometimes people just don't know. I mean, what was David Hinsberger's term? I was trying to think about that. When people offend, but they don't know they actually offended. I'm blanking on the term, but I think it's true. You know, some people that I've worked with said, well, oh, I didn't, and you said the same thing, Kate. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was wrong. Well, they should have known, but we didn't tell them. Yeah.
Right. Or even your stories before about making sure that the staff just addresses the issue of wanting female panties, right? Instead of, or going to a sex store. Like a
Right.
lot of this is finding ourselves being more comfortable
Yeah.
too, and spreading that. And I try to make everybody listen to this podcast because those stories are so meaningful. But, you know, people are, like I was saying, people don't think of this population as people. So the idea that they would have any sexuality or any developing hormones like regular people, it's like lost on the community. A lot of people think these are just children in grown-up bodies. They can only be protected. They cannot be adults that make their own decisions ever.
I'm big on research, and I keep a lot of, we do risk screenings and we do a lot of the treatment and support. And I look back on the statistics of people who reoffend then. And at this point, we have a 97% success rate. 97%.
It doesn't shock me at all. I think it's such an educatable population.
Exactly.
Not just the clients, but like the families. The police are hard. I mean, there's all of these places besides Children's Hospital are low paying, unappreciated jobs. So the turnover is high. So even if the officers were all trained 2 years ago, you might have 3 new officers in that tiny district and they don't know. But they also, one of them might be particularly akin to it and they might be extra protective of that. It's too objective or subjective at that level. At the early level, there's too much discretion for police and district attorneys to decide that we're going to go ahead and prosecute without the intent. I feel like officers ask questions to get clients to admit to the act without, they know not to ask about the intent, because if they said to your client who's charged with stalking, well, how many times did you go there? They're going to say, I go every day at 4:05 because that's when she gets off the bus or whatever. They're going to admit to doing something. And the officer isn't going to say why. And if they do say why, and the client just says, so I can see her, they're going to interpret that and they're going to characterize it as an intent to bother her.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Two Old Sexperts. Join us next time as we talk about internet safety.